We're excited about today's timely session. We started around 2007. Those of you maybe not as familiar with FCP, we've supported the behavioral health and human service space here in Bucks County since that time, supporting children, young adults, and families right here in Bucks County. We do that through grants to nonprofit organizations, scholarships to high school students, as well as subsidizing service learning programs for college students, and also offering professional development programs such as today and information sessions. So most recently, our board decided to join the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund, which is a pooled funding effort among, and I think Lindsay will certainly know much more about this than I do, about 13 local funders that are there to improve capacity, effectiveness, and financial sustainability among the nonprofit space. And this, for FCP, was a wonderful opportunity to invest in something that we don't necessarily offer through some of our grant programs, and also a very timely investment based on, obviously, the current landscape. So we're very excited to have Lindsay with us here this morning. She is a partner with Sea Change Capital Partners, and also the fund's director. And also later you will hear from Kristyn DiDominick. She is the executive director of the Bucks-Mont Collaborative, and also an FCP board member. So thank you to both of you for being here this morning and sharing your knowledge with everybody. A few quick housekeeping items before I turn this over to Lindsay. Please keep yourself muted. I think we're all familiar with the Zoom space, but well, with the amount of people we have here today, we try to avoid any background noises. Pop any questions that you have in the chat. There's also a link to the slide deck that you can use, but pop any questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. As I said, the link is there as well to the slide deck. You will also receive an email after this program with a link to the slide deck, and feel free to share that as well. And then this recording will be available by next week on our YouTube channel. So just hop on YouTube and look up Foundations Community Partnership, and it will be there, and you can review that as well as share that with anybody you wish. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Lindsay, and thank you again for offering the session to our nonprofit community here in Bucks County. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Toby, and I'm thrilled to be joined, by Kristyn, who has been through our process and is going to be far more interesting about in sharing the experience of the work than I am. So please stay tuned for her contributions towards the end of this session as well. But thrilled to be here with all of you this morning to share some information about the Repositioning Fund and the work we support. So the Repositioning Fund, as Toby mentioned, is a 13 or a pooled funding collaborative of 13 of the area's foundations who have all made a commitment to support nonprofits in either exploring or planning what we broadly call sustained collaboration activity in order to increase their impact or their resiliency. And I'm going to share a lot more detail about what we mean by sustained collaboration, what these transactions and this type of work looks like. But really excited to have the partnership of Foundations Community Partnership, specifically because we have been a resource ever since our founding in 2015 for Philadelphia, Bucks, Chester, Delaware, and Montgomery counties. But Foundations Community Partnership joining the table this year marks the first time that we've had a Bucks County specific funder part of the group, which has been wonderful to have Toby around the table with us, sharing the needs of Bucks County nonprofits and bringing that viewpoint so that he can be a champion and an advocate for the work, the fantastic work that's being done in all areas of Bucks County. And so it's a really exciting time for the fund, and looking forward to sharing some more information about the work we're supporting this year. And so, as you'll see, we work in 5 counties and across all geographies, all sector and size sort of buckets for nonprofits. So we take a sector blind approach to the grant making. We've made grants to arts and culture, human services, education, all across the map in terms of service provision. And then same with size. We've made grants to organizations that have sort of $0 annual budgets and are fully volunteer run and led and fundraise for specific activities and programs as needed, all the way up to we were at the table to help support the Kimmel Center and the Philadelphia Orchestra and coming together. So this is really a tool that we believe should be available to all nonprofits, regardless of sector size, the way they're funded. And we've seen really great outcomes, regardless of some of those individual facets. So before diving in on what our process looks like, I'd love to just sort of skip to the highlight and share what the grants are available to support and how those are structured. So since 2015, we've made around 128 grants, totaling just around $2.7 million. And we work with nonprofits at various stages of readiness or through the process of discerning whether or not they'd like to come together in partnership. So we do have small seed grants available. That's the only type of funding that's available to individual organizations as of now. And those grants cap out at about $2,500 to help support discrete readiness needs for potentially entering a partnership exploration. So we'll see organizations use those seed awards often for helping to determine which partner might be the best to explore a partnership with, or any other type of individual readiness need that's needed. So space assessment, any sort of financial forecasting, those are some of the major buckets we see folks use seed awards to help defray. But then I would say that our most sort of our hallmark grant program covers the exploratory and implementation phases. And that is helping organizations decide whether or not to move forward in partnership for the exploratory grants. And then if they do decide to move forward in partnership, then there's a second tranche of funding available in the implementation grants to help get from the point of making the decision all the way through to the enactment of whatever the new collaborative format is. So what do we mean when we talk about sustained collaboration, right? Because I think there are many, many ways for nonprofits to collaborate. Some of them get a little bit more airtime than others. And so I wanted to share a little bit just about the full spectrum of opportunity that is available for organizations. We fund across this entire spectrum, right? So everything from the less formal alliances, networks, formats that allow organizations to keep a lot of their individual identity, programming, and autonomy, but do work together in partnership with others, all the way up to, your very standard and very formal mergers, which integrate all facets of the organization. So I would, challenge folks when they come to the fund thinking that one type of collaboration may be for them, to keep an open mind, right? Because I do think that there is a lot of sort of black and white thinking around whether or not formal collaboration may be a useful tool for an organization. And I found that with a little bit of creativity and an open mind, there's often a lot of opportunity that organizations aren't thinking about in that first sort of pass or that first call, just because there isn't a ton of information about these different types of collaborative formats out there. And so we have a lot of that information available on our fund or on our website for the fund, repositioningfund.org. And then there are other, support organizations around the country that help nonprofits work through considering whether or not this may be right for them, including a national network of funders called the Sustained Collaboration Network, which has an excellent website to flesh out these ideas and make it clear for nonprofits what some of the benefits may be and um, how to work through the process from the individual organizational level. But so once again, on the less formal end, things like alliances and networks, things to uh, harness collective wisdom, collective knowledge. In that middle piece, we're seeing a lot of activity on the shared service arrangement side of things. So that could be either co-location, shared staffing, shared back office, anything that is formal in nature that allows organizations to harness some of the efficiencies that come with sharing pieces of the business. And then all the way on that other side, mergers, asset and program transfers, we cover it all. And so if you're wondering which format may be best for your organization, or if you're considering collaboration and not sure which of these formats may yield some of the benefits that you're hoping to achieve, I would say that the function usually begets the form, right? I think coming into the process with an open mind, but a clear understanding of what benefits you're hoping to achieve is very useful, because then often, if you can articulate what you're hoping to get out of potentially collaborating, it becomes easier to determine which format that collaboration may take. So alliances and networks, as I mentioned, it's a great way to help pool expertise and resources, harness collective wisdom, speak with, a single voice for advocacy or policy, while still, being able to retain individual identity, individual programming options. Those are some of the reasons why folks will come to the table for an alliance or a network. Shared services, this one really comes down to often efficiencies, right? So being able to share cost, being able to share functions across organizations, and being able to leverage the, various strengths of the organizations in a more formalized way without fully integrating and coming together. And then the integrated organizations, so mergers and other types of collaboration that fundamentally shift those business models and change the way that an organization is recognized, either by its clients or its internal staff. This is where we see combination at all levels. So combining personnel, administrative, programmatic areas, all with the hope of usually enhancing service offerings, expanding reach, and eliminating redundancies in terms of cost. So you may be wondering why folks consider collaboration as part of their, regular planning for their organization. And I think that, we've been in this in, the Philadelphia region for about 10 years, and we have learned a lot and seen a lot of different models in that time. And we've bucketed the motivations, right, into these three major areas. I'm hoping to achieve financial outcomes, positive financial outcomes, programmatic outcomes, or outcomes related to organizational capacity. So to go into a bit more detail on each of these, financial, we see organizations coming, trying to combine purchasing power to tap into economies of scale. But I would say that the most common reasons why folks come with the financial lens is to either stabilize financial position or advance fundraising opportunity. And the ways in which that happens tend to be kind of threefold. Sometimes when one organization is experiencing financial challenge or concern, they can look to an organization that may be a bit more solid, might have a stronger financial position, to see whether or not there's a way to collaborate that would allow them to, capitalize on some of that financial strength. But a lot of the sort of gains we see financially from this work actually come from the realm of the fundraising, right? So let's say that my organization works with K through second grade students for an after school program. And Kristyn's organization works with the middle schoolers for an after school program, right? And we've been wondering whether or not there may be a way for us to work together. And we're both hearing interest from our various clients that it would be great to think about a way to have more services from each of the organizations, rather than me trying to start from scratch, build out a middle school program, find qualified people to run it, and try to achieve even an ounce of the kind of success that Kristyn may have found already by doing this work for a while. Um, that's going to be very inefficient compared to giving Kristyn a call and saying, "Hi, I would love to learn from you. I would love to, think about the ways in which we might work together in our respective client populations to better serve our community as a whole." And so most times this work represents an expansion of services or a growth into a new area, which usually comes with different funding that's available, right? So if you're expanding and providing more services in new areas, there's often, new funding sources available to support that work. But additionally, I would say that a very common byproduct of this work is that there's often, staff opportunity for staff to specialize and bring more functions in-house. So some organizations will come to this table to be able to bring fundraising or have a dedicated development person on staff. And we've seen a few examples, for instance, of two organizations that can each afford to employ a part-time development, director or consultant, but together, maybe by pooling their resources, can offer one full-time development role with benefits attached, and hence be able to attract, a higher level of talent, some more professionalized staff there. So that in turn will lead to better funds, or more funds raised or better fundraising results for the organization. So while the ultimate outcomes would be financial, you'll see that there's some organizational capacity, positive outcomes interwoven into the ways that organizations improve financial position through this work. To talk about the programmatic piece, this is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't spend too much time on it. I gave one example in terms of, that after school programs with Kristyn. Organizations will come to this table to, rather than compete and reinvent the wheel, capitalize on what other peers in the space are doing well, and think about ways to harness some of that expertise together. So growing and enhancing programs is a very common motivation for organizations to come to this work. In light of some of the volatility and uncertainty around the funding climate right now, however, we're seeing a lot more interest related to preservation of programs, right? And I would say that this work takes a lot of creativity and some courage, right, from the leaders who undertake it, because, sometimes when you're considering that you are in service to the mission and not to the organizational structure, preserving programs will mean, okay, this program is no longer in its best home within my organization, or it could be at home within my organization, but we really need to find a way to increase the capacity of this organization to ensure that it can survive so that our clients, never have a lapse in service. And so collaboration is a really, really underutilized in some ways tool for preserving programs that might be vulnerable or at risk due to changes in policy or changes in funding. And then lastly, I've touched a little bit on organizational capacity throughout the other two, but succession planning tends to be one of the most significant drivers of this work. If a longtime executive director or leader of the organization is moving on and you're trying to think about, at that organizational inflection point, how the work will be completed in the future without that individual helming it, sometimes the answer is, joining forces with somebody else that you've worked with to be able to harness, more experienced talent in that way, or get a, more experienced leader to lead joint work on behalf of several organizations. And while, I think, I'm a bit biased, right? I have seen collaboration. I'm very lucky to spend most of my days speaking with organizations who are being super, super creative about how to collaborate and how to serve their communities better by collaboration. So, on the whole, I find this to be a really positive thing for organizations to undertake, including my own. We've been through a couple of these transfers and mergers as well. But that said, I would be remiss not to cover some of the common concerns that organizations have when they're considering this work for themselves as well. So, some of the concerns that organizations tend to have are a loss of independence, potential reduction in funding by coming together. Let's say two organizations both receive funding from a common source and are nervous that will that source give us the same combined amount that they give both of our organizations, or is this going to be a opportunity for funding to be cut? Some organizations have concern about board leadership and like staff perceptions towards coming together. Often there's a lot of passion and identity wrapped up in nonprofit work, and these cultural changes can be really big and concerning, right? So that's all extremely valid. And I think the most significant concern we actually hear is actually the one that is listed last: lack of organizational capacity to merge. I work for a nonprofit. We I've spent my whole career in the nonprofit sector, and I'm no stranger to kind of the way that these organizations operate. Sometimes people have two or three or five jobs at once, all under one hat, and it takes extra time and effort and resources to make these things happen and to see some of the positive outcomes that are available to organizations, right? And so that's a very valid concern. And the way that the repositioning fund's funding and work is designed is deliberate to help mitigate some of these concerns. So I am going to talk a little bit through our process now and how we help with, mitigating some of that risk and concern. So, our two major steps that we help resource for organizations are exploration and then planning or implementation. And so I'll start with exploration. It's a very open-ended stage where the goal is to decide whether or not to move forward with, the collaboration, whatever it may be. And so at this point, we require that organizations do have a partner identified and are dedicated to a period of deliberate exploration with that partner. It can really range, or it can really range in terms of how long that exploration will be or how involved it is. And a lot of that will depend on whether or not there was an existing working relationship among those organizations in advance. And so the average amount of time we see organizations taking to explore is about 6 months, but we've seen it take much shorter, a couple of months or weeks even, and then we've seen it be far more complex and take much longer to make a decision of whether or not to move forward. What I love about this stage and what I love about the sort of openness of the funders who sit around our table to support this work is that everyone is very comfortable with the fact that there is no expected outcome at this stage, right? We're really here to create the safe space and resource the conversation, but we see the decision not to move forward in partnership to be equally as valuable as the decision to move forward in partnership, as long as there was some learning and an understanding of why that partner may not be the best at this stage for the organization. At this stage, we see organizations prioritizing mission and cultural alignment alongside the legal, financial, and programmatic decisions that have to be made in order to decide whether or not they're moving forward. And yeah, the grants tend to cover things like consultants, facilitators, any element of the feasibility studying or due diligence that's required for you and your organization's decision makers be whether that be your boards or your advisory boards or you as executive leadership, to have all the information necessary in order to decide whether or not to move forward. So this stage takes you really from the ideation all the way through to that decision point. And if you do decide to move forward in partnership, then there's a second tranche of funding available called implementation or planning grants, which is designed to help organizations get from the point of that decision being made all the way through to the actual enactment of whatever the new format is. And so at this stage, it's no longer hypothetical. It's getting more granular in terms of the planning and the brass tacks of what it will take for the two organizations to come together in whatever format they've chosen. And it's a pretty broad, right? Because of the different ways that the organizations can decide whether or not to move forward and what format they decide on. The costs will be all over the map at this stage. But I would say that some of the most common things we see organizations seeking implementation grants for is more facilitation to kind of business plan for the joint entity at this phase, unless both organizations have legal or pro bono legal, then we often see, legal fees as part of the aggregate here. Any element of systems integration, be that IT, finance, HR, and then, anything else that's needed to bring the organizations together. So often some cultural strategy or some governance strategy, any type of program strategy that needs to be revised. We would help with looking at defraying the costs for those. Usually this phase takes about 12 months to complete. I'd love for, when Kristyn is speaking, I'd love to hear, kind of what that timeline has looked like realistically for you. There's a very wide range here, and it will depend on what the format is too. And so we tend to stay in touch with organizations for 2 years post the implementation date. And sometimes at that 2-year point, it feels very complete, and at other times it doesn't, right? This work tends to have a long tail and can depend on what else is going on in the organization. In terms of ongoing, mission critical programs or activities to determine how much bandwidth there is to devote to the actual integration of the orgs. And so I'd say on average, 9 to 12 months is the average time frame, but it can be much shorter or much longer depending on what the complexity in the format are. Okay. And so in terms of how we think about success in this work, because a lot of it is quite relative and organizations come to the table with very different motivations. So the short answer is that the way that we define success as a group, we reflect it back to the organizations, right? We ask you to help us understand what success will look like for you. And that's the answer. So no one's going to know this work or your organization better than you. And so the success or how we measure success in individual transactions comes down to, are you able to achieve some of the outcomes you were hoping for by considering collaboration to begin with? And as you'll see, some of those transactional success factors include things like increased fundraising capacity, better organizational visibility, more communities or clients served, being able to provide more services at a higher quality, opportunities for staff to specialize or be retained and have better trajectories within the organization, and any sort of element of cost savings or operational efficiency. But that said, we spend so much time, resourcing and helping organizations through the process. So we also wanted to share some of the success factors we've observed for the process and when organizations leave it feeling satisfied and, excited about the outcomes they're able to achieve. And so some of those things include time, right? Time and bandwidth to devote to the process and determining whether or not the fund can help with investments that will allow the organizations to add bandwidth, even in an interim way to navigate the process. having really strong internal clarity about what you hope to gain out of the process going in is another common sort of success factor. Being able to engage in honest, upfront conversation, both internally with your stakeholders, but also with your partner organizations, and if you have consultants helping with them as well, some amount of positive working experience with one another. And this can be as sort of involved as we've been working on joint programming together for many years. And it can be as new as we underwent the repositioning funds process together and jointly applied for funding and received it, and then went through, a facilitated exploration. That's why we require that both partners participate in any of our diligence processes and grant making processes, so that there is that time to build the rapport if it wasn't already there, and build that working relationship and trust. So this work is hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. All of our work is hard, I believe, as nonprofit orgs. The nonprofit sector exists for a reason. We're working on very, significant social problems every day. And so I applaud this sector. We're no strangers to hard work, but this is no exception to that paradigm. And so I won't go through all of these challenges in detail, but these are some of the common, challenges and sticking points that organizations can encounter through the process. The legal and regulatory pieces that they have no control over, all the way through to the things that, they do have a lot of control over, determining who that CEO will be to lead the joint entity, or figuring out how to involve stakeholders in the process. And so to spend a little time on a couple, the outsized influence of a particular founder or funder. There's a lot of feelings that go into the work, and folks put a lot of themselves into the work. And so it's often very useful to have that third party facilitator there as a neutral voice to help make the best decisions for all the partners involved, and balance the needs of many different stakeholders in a process that is collaborative by design. And I would also like to spend just a little time on this one, of cultural or board misalignment, but also anything that requires a lot of digging in to make a decision where partners aren't aligned. Moving at the speed of trust is something that we say often in this work. It's really important to be able to um, get everything done in this process while you're running programs and services, but that can't be manufactured. It really has to be done at the speed that the organizations are comfortable with. And there are lots of sort of internal checking points that organizations going through this work that I'm sure Kristyn will highlight in her part in just a second, that help determine at various points whether everybody's still on board, whether everybody's still bought in, and sort of helps to set the course on how best to move forward. And so to close out my piece, I'd just like to share, like, this work really is best when it comes from inside the house, right? Once again, we will never know as funders or as, media facilitators of this work. We'll never know as your work or your organization as well as you do. And that's a given. And so as you think about whether or not this may be a good tool for your own organization, I would say that remember to keep mission, centric, right? Like all of the pieces of, financial, outcomes or programmatic outcomes all need to roll up into a strong mission-centric orientation. If it doesn't make sense for your missions, it won't make sense writ large. An understanding of the assets, both tangible and intangible, hard and soft, and understanding how those assets will play into the negotiations and into the joint entity. Having that understanding from the front end will be, invaluable. also having a good sense of the non-negotiables and what is absolutely crucial and critical for delivering on your mission, being able to advocate for those things in the process, and knowing that if it isn't on your non-negotiable list, being able to bend or flex a bit more to accommodate your partner. And then lastly, having a really strong sense of the reality for your organization, both internal and external. And when I mean internal reality, I'm really thinking about capacity, the funds, the manpower to move some of these things forward. And if you don't have some of those internal capacity pieces, being able to seek out external sources to provide some of that capacity. But then also remembering that there is a big, set of um, things that affect the organization that are happening externally as well. So whether that be a change in the funding or a change in the policy that affects your work, staying abreast of what those, outside pieces are, and making sure to intersperse them through the process, and interweave them is going to lead to much better outcomes in the end. And so with that, I will stop and pass it over to Kristyn, who will share about her fantastic collaboration.
Thank you, Lindsay. Okay, I am new to Canva presentations, so I'm going to ask someone to unmute and tell me if when I share my screen you see it, because I won't be able to see you, but I want to make sure that you can see what I'm sharing out. So let's learn together. Do you see this? Okay, excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so good morning. I'm Kristyn DiDominick. I'm a board member with Foundations Community Partnership, and I'm also the executive director of the Bucks-Mont Collaborative. And of course, here in this room, I just want to acknowledge I have two of my board members with me, including my board president, Jennifer King, and Kim with BCHIP. So I'm pleased if I've forgotten anything. Jen and Kim, please feel free to chime in. Okay, so there's a little bit on here. So I want to just pause and kind of level set our experience and kind of why we applied to the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund. And actually, you know what I'll do? I'll go back so we're not all just staring at all of that text. It's a lot of text. So the Bucks-Mont Collaborative, the Interagency Council of Norristown, and the Tri-County Community Network, three collaboratives in this region, had in 2020 launched, at the time we called it a racial equity learning community together. And we had found that that was such a significant initiative needed at the time in this region. And when we did it together, we were able to achieve greater impact, both in terms of our collective fundraising, so we could make that initiative free for any organization that wanted to participate, as well as the learning, the reduction and duplication, right? Kind of all of those things that Lindsay just talked about. We felt like, wow, that we saw the success of that. And then it also allowed us to build some really deep trust together, because there's nothing like working on a project day in and day out where you really have to rely on one another to build that relationship. And so when we fast forward to, at the time it was 2022, both our organization, the Collaborative, and the Tri-County Community Network were thinking about strategic planning. And we were talking together about this process, and we realized that kind of wanted to walk the talk and do the work collaboratively together. We recognized that both of us doing these siloed strategic plans really didn't align with kind of the impact that we had seen when we had come together. And so we reached out to our boards, and amazingly, the board said, okay, let's do this. Let's have a collaborative strategic plan. And because you've been parts of strategic plan, it's hard enough to do it with just one board, one staff, all your stakeholders. And now we had three boards coming together and being committed to asking ourselves the big questions. And so I just want to just a couple of samples. We were asking ourselves these types of questions. How can this moment actualize the vision of the collaboratives as coordinated hubs for all in the sector? And at that point, we were still deep in the pandemic. So we were in a really different landscape. What community assets can be leveraged for transformational change? Where are the gaps? How can our collaboratives collectively bridge some of those gaps and infuse resources? So we were asking really big questions. And so we reached out to Health Spark Foundation. We were able to get a grant to support the strategic plan. And here's kind of this screen. You don't have to read all of it. Happy to share it out after if you're like really fascinated by our strategic planning process. But we created an overarching strategy, which is here. And then these 4 areas where we felt we could really focus our resources. And that was around community engagement, advocacy, resource sharing, and network opportunities. Okay. So we had really done what Lindsay was talking about with the exploration grant. We had kind of covered that. We had gotten a funder, and here we were ready for implementation. And we recognized that, wow, we really needed some support to make this happen, because the strategy was bold, it was visionary, and the work was both broad and deep. And so we needed to bring in a lot of technical assistance to help us with this. So you can see here, we applied for an implementation grant through the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund. We secured that grant. Thank you, Lindsay. It was fantastic. And this is what it allowed us to do, right? It allowed us to be catalytic in the work, because as Lindsay said, this work is hard. We are all very lean organizations. So we did not have an abundant staff to delegate. When we tackle this work, it's the executive directors and our lean staff doing the work. So what it allowed us to do was to bring in vendors who could provide technical assistance in key areas that we did not have, but we were critical. And so one I want to call out, which Lindsay mentioned, is this like backbone support. We needed a third party to keep us on track, because what we didn't want to do is break down the relationships that we had taken so long to build and the trust that we had built. Because I am, gently nudging Holly over at TCN, who's reminding Candy at ICN to like get the work done, right? We needed someone to come in and say, we're going to hold this container for you. We're going to provide meeting facilitation support. We're going to also do some mapping work so we stay on track with deadlines. So a neutral party is saying to us, you're falling behind or you're ahead here, and we really needed that. And that was permitted within the implementation grant. So we were able to get this year-round support, which was truly where the majority of our grant went, and we really needed to be able to move from a plan to implementation. We needed additional. We couldn't do it alone. It also allowed us to contract with Larky Design, who we're almost there. Lindsay, I can't wait to show you the website. It is like the slowest part of our process. If any of you have been a part of like a web development, it's like the last thing you're doing, because you're doing the work and then you're like, well, I'm not going to market the work. I'm just doing it, right? But we need the website. We're so close. And in part, it's taken us extra time because what we've also asked is for Nancy with Larky Design to build out a shared membership directory so that at any given point, others could go in and find organizations in Bucks-Mont and Chester County and be able to filter and sort by mission and field and zip code and others. So we're really trying to think about how can we augment some of the work that's happening in sectors like 211 or PA Navigate or others. So we're almost there. It also allowed us to really look at revenue generation, because what we recognized was we had this point in time implementation grant, but that would not understandably carry us through this work long term. So we needed financial consulting. And I highly recommend that if you're looking at this and you're asking yourselves questions around sustainability and you're applying for something like an implementation grant, that you consider bringing in a financial consultant to help you think this through, unless you have that, in-house expertise. But for us, we needed to think about things like, could there be a shared membership model amongst all of us? Where are there opportunities to generate revenue together that we haven't considered? What can you leverage? And so we needed some financial forecasts with them for us. And then, of course, it also allowed us to contract with an attorney to think about things like MOUs and contracts and things that we just hadn't considered because we've just been kind of doing the work. And not that any of us weren't committed, but if I step away or other leaders step away or my board chair changes, rather, we want those contracts in place so that the organization is committed and it's not just that verbal of the staff saying, like, we're going to do the work. We wanted something in writing to, of course, support this long term. And what that allowed us to really do is to speak to programmatic and the community impact that we want. So I just named a couple of things here. This isn't like all of our grant, because I know that you're here to learn about like what the fund can do for you and less to learn necessarily what it did for us. But I want to give you a couple examples so that you can really see, this picture of like intentional, like how we could nurture the work and how we could grow it. So in, contracting with Strategy Arts allowed us to develop something like a community advisory board, because we could also contract with them to do national research on best practices as it relates to like, who does this work well? How do we actually create a community advisory board that is sustainable, that's impactful, right? And kind of work with them so that we're not doing that work, but we're learning from them, and then they're helping us set up the ecosystem. It also allowed us to think about things like, how do we build grassroots or support for grassroots groups, and to really think about like, how do we do that, like intentional convening. And so working with Strategy Arts allowed us to be able to think this through with an organization that does that work in Philadelphia already. So we could get, again, catalytic. It allowed us to think about things like, how can we maximize, and I'm here under resource sharing, a shared training institute together. We had already been doing some of that work, but it allowed us the space and the time to step back and really be thoughtful about how we could scaffold our years together. So that, when we said, like, we're not duplicating, we're reducing costs, so that if I bring in a trainer, ICN and CCN don't have to pay for that trainer, and vice versa, right? And then we're also kind of sharing that out with all of our networks, so things are more accessible. And then it allowed us to really consider, like, how do we network differently and bring folks together across county? And so we've created some really interesting pilots around this that also speak to like the leadership being of our sector. So we piloted a mid-level leadership program together. We would never have done that had we not done this work together, but it spoke to the needs of the sector, and we were able to do it because we had already built out the relationships by doing this work together nearby. So one final thing. So beyond the grant, if I'm you and I'm thinking, I'm going to apply for this grant, it's not going to be just the dollars. The dollars absolutely matter. And Lindsay, you might notice I stole like an infographic from your website. So on the right-hand side, okay, good. I want to just call out some of the benefits to us on just the grant. What is that? What has the grant allowed us to do this work? It has organically seeded other partnerships and opportunities, because we're in now rooms and spaces with others doing similar work that we wouldn't have been in had we not had the opportunity to get started, right? So as we've gone through this like year now, 2 years together, we have had this beautiful snowball effect where we've grown and stretched and built relationships in ways that we just wouldn't have had we not been in those spaces. So just want to name that as something that's tremendously powerful. It's also allowed us to leverage additional funding and organizational visibility, because again, we're able to scale up and be a little bit more catalytic in the work, which has allowed us to get noticed by other funders. So that's allowed us to leverage additional models. You get access to wonderful thought leaders like Lindsay. So, of course, Lindsay, I put your email right in here. So, there's conversations that can come, as Lindsay said, they stay, connected with you for a couple of years. So you also have access to Lindsay's LinkedIn as well as the board. They have great resources on their website. And then I think we just can't overstate this enough, that the process deepens the trust with your partners, and it builds out the relationship. So often when I have questions, the first person I call are my partner at TCN and ICN, as well as my board. Don't worry, Jen and Kim, I also call you, but I work with them regularly. And because we are deep in this work together, we have built a level of trust and understanding with one another that is so valued, and really allows us to have tough conversations when the work gets hard and to really stay connected. So that is in a nutshell with our experience with the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund, and it has been truly transformative. And so if you're considering it, I encourage you to take the leap and to think about what this could mean, and then allow the process to also be your guide as you think about when you apply, ask you the questions you really need to consider before you even submit. And that was tremendously helpful. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Lindsay, Kristyn, awesome presentation. I know it's a lot to fit in yeah, about 50 minutes or so. So thank you for doing that. And everybody else, for your own mindfulness, take a deep breath. It's a lot of information that was shared this morning. Doesn't mean that by the end of the day you need to implement and have this amazing idea for collaboration. But it's really something that we feel is another great asset in your toolbox that hopefully when the time comes, you can reach into that toolbox, pull it out, and start the conversation. As Kristyn said, it was really helpful to kind of see that play out in real time, describing the process that the Bucks-Mont Collaborative went through with other area organizations. So you kind of see how thoughtful the process is, and that there are uncertainties, and as that plays out. For those local to us, you also seen that with organizations like Immigrant Rights Action and Welcoming the Stranger. PA, who recently came together, also supported in large by the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund. So I certainly encourage you to, if you are thinking about it, have conversations with Kristyn, with Heidi, and, to kind of get a little bit more feedback, but also obviously with Lindsay, if you're thinking about it, as you can see, everybody's very approachable. And when it comes to some of the strategic planning or succession planning, you also have access to local foundations like us at FCP. Have a conversation with Caroline and myself about those efforts, because we do support those through our nonprofit growth grant cycle. So there are lots of opportunities available for you as you are contemplating that. So that said, we wanted to get to a couple of questions here that were posted in the chat, and the first one is for you, Lindsay. Do most organizations who receive exploratory funding and decide to move forward with collaboration then receive implementation funding as well?
Yeah, so I would say folks find us at all different points in the process. So as Kristyn mentioned, right, they found another funder to support exploratory, and that was great, right? But you don't need to go through all of our processes, so it's not sequential. You don't need to get an exploratory grant to get an implementation grant. But out of the organizations that do decide to move forward from the exploratory process, I think about 40% of our exploratory grantees have moved through to implementation, and we've been able to fund about 80% of those, so 40%, right? So we're able to fund most of the requests at some level.
Yeah, and we had another comment here, not so much of a question, but a comment by Valerie, Voice and Vision, about their shared services with another organization about an HR professional. But I think that's a very good example of that. A lot of organizations can't afford another full-time person. So that is really a really good suggestion to start thinking about, especially if you're aligned, you're like-minded in what you're trying to achieve, to share staffing resources, which especially during this time where funding may be a little bit more in flux and you don't really know what you can count on. For the time being, that have those conversations, and that there are resources available to help in exploring that and putting that into implementation. In terms of, Lindsay, tell a little bit more about some of the Bucks County funding that you've provided in the past, to give folks here on the call a little bit more sense of what we've done in the space, even though we're the first foundation to join actively from Bucks County.
Yeah, gladly. So the Bucks County has, even though Toby and FCP is the first specific funder for Bucks County, about 27% of our portfolio has been organizations that touch Bucks County or provide services in Bucks County over the past 10 years. And so one of my favorite examples is obviously C3, the Bucks-Mont Collaborative, Tri-County Network, and Interagency Council of Norristown, and their incredible work. Because also it's kind of this meta thing where you're helping other people collaborate as a result of your collaboration. And so that's not just because Kristyn's on this call, but this is one of my favorite projects the fund has supported in my time leading it. As Toby mentioned, welcome Project PA and Immigrants' Rights Action. We're really thrilled for Josh and Heidi, have been with them for both exploratory and implementation. And so overall, out of that kind of $2.7 million that the fund has granted over the past 10 years, about 700,000 of that has touched Bucks County in some way, shape, or form, which is great. And yeah, I would say all of our exploratory grants, with the exception of those that move forward to implementation, are confidential. So at least from my standpoint, however, there are, other folks that we have funded in Bucks County who are actively in exploration right now. So I can't blow up anything too. I can't blow too much truth here today, but this is something that's very active in the county, and organizations in the county are definitely considering it.
Yeah, let's not reveal any secrets. But I just want to make sure nobody felt like that you're a Bucks County test case or something if you're starting to reach out. So the fund has been here within the community, and we're certainly glad that our board decided to make that initial 2-year commitment. So we'll be in this for some time. Also want to recognize another board member who joined, Walt Storts, who is on the call. So thank you, Walt, for being here as well. But certainly any questions that you have, or you want to just discuss some ideas that you have, don't hesitate to reach out to Caroline and myself, as well as obviously Lindsay, as well as Kristyn. All of them would be happy to take your call, answer your email, have a conversation, and see where that will lead. Maybe it will lead to some type of collaboration. Maybe will lead to some type of funding. But it's always good to have that discussion about your idea.